Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. And I'm your host, Mike Allen. It's the end of the world. Time to get ready to go to heaven. Jesus is returning for the second coming, and only true believers are going to follow him in the Great Ascension. Our guest today is going to tell us about the time in 1873 when a large group of folks thought this was indeed going to happen, and they gathered on an island in the Connecticut River. Tim Casey is a member of the Suffield Historical Society, and he writes their blog. Suffield is adjacent to the island where this took place, and he's going to be along in a moment with our incredible story. This week's trivia question, it's called Scoville, and it marked a huge change in how society developed. What was Scoville, and why did it change our development trajectory? Well, stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you're going to know the topic for next week's show. The end of the world. How many times have you seen drawings of people dressed in toga-style outfits waiting for the end of the world? And they're prepared because a religious figure told them that the world was going to end and only true believers in Jesus Christ would be ascended and allowed into heaven. Well, today's episode is about just that. It turns out the Second-day Adventists was a very active religious order in the 1800s, and they absolutely believed that you could find the right clues and wording in the Bible to make a prediction of when the world was going to end. Now, technically, they were looking for what is called the second coming of Christ, a day when Jesus would return to earth, end the world, and bring the true believers with him into heaven. Well, as you're going to hear, these predictions came in several different forms and timelines over the years, but to hear it from the leader's perspective, you just had to know the secret for coming up with the right formula for when all this was going to happen. Now, the Second-day Adventists were very active in the northeast of the United States. Their first leader, William Miller, came from the border area between Vermont and New York, and he started a following known as Millerism. He was the first to use the Bible to predict an actual year when the world was going to end, and his followers believed him. After he died, and his three predictions didn't exactly come to fruition, that torch was passed to a Connecticut man who continued to look for signs that the world was going to end. As you'll hear, the prediction involving the Connecticut religious leader brought the followers to an island in the Connecticut River between Suffield, Windsor Locks, and Enfield. That's the northern part of the state, near Massachusetts. Interestingly, it is near the only remaining canal in the state of Connecticut, the Windsor Locks Canal. Now, as you may recall from earlier Amazing Tales episodes, the Farmington Canal, which ran from New Haven into Massachusetts, was finally filled in and replaced by first a railroad and then a hike-bike trail. The Windsor Locks Canal, though, allows boats on the Connecticut River to bypass the non-navigable Enfield Falls. It's adjacent to Kings Island, where today's story takes place. And in fact, if you walk the former towpath of the Windsor Locks Canal, you'll come to a point where Kings Island is clearly visible from the west bank of the Connecticut River. Otherwise, it's a little secluded and hard to see. It was from that towpath that people who wanted to go to the island could take a ferry boat to reach it back in the 1800s, and you'll hear more about that in today's episode. Well, here to tell us about this endearing story of the end of the world on Kings Island is the man who writes the blog for the Suffield Historical Society, Tim Casey. So, Tim, as I explained to the listeners in the beginning, this is just an incredible story about a Connecticut guy who predicted the end of the world, got 100 people to come to his island in northern Connecticut in the Connecticut River and wait to be ascended to heaven. And now we're going to go through the details. And I think to really set this up, for people who don't know about Kings Island, I'd love for you to describe it. I mean, you're from that area. You know about it. Tell me about Kings Island. Where is it? What's it like? How rustic is it? How do you get there? All those things.
Kings Island sits in the Connecticut River in between Suffield and Enfield. It's about 125 acres. If you were to look at it today, it is returned to nature, part of a wildlife management area. It was farmland. The way that it's situated in the river makes it an ideal place for a ferry. It's at kind of a narrow point, so ideal kind of crossing place.
So this is something, and I'm glad you brought this up, because When this guy, Terry, who we're going to talk about, DeWitt, Clinton, Terry, throughout this, when Terry ended up buying the island, at least the southern part, and developing it and whatnot, you can visit it by boat. I understand when you go there, you can still see a rusty chain around the tree where he tied a cable to that tree and extended that cable across to the western shore of the Connecticut River where Suffield is, and then tied his flat ferry boat to that cable, and that's how he got people back and forth. Did I get that right?
You absolutely got that right. And on top of that, you can additionally see the remains of the stone foundation of his house too. So even though it has returned to nature, there are still hints there of what it once was when it was somebody's home.
He's not only just this ferry boat operator, right? Like you said, it was farmland. He developed a farm, and he had, I mean, there was a lot of shad and salmon in the river at the right time. So I guess he and his wife and two daughters, they would have a place where you could come and buy fish. And he was a woodworker. He had a very interesting side occupation, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. He was listed as a cabinet maker. A cabinet maker doesn't exactly mean the same thing today as it did back then. His main business as a cabinet maker was the coffin making business. Really, he was an incredibly diverse portfolio, as we would say. He was a farmer, but he was also a ferryman, and on top of that, he was, had this fish business, and if that wasn't enough, he was also making coffins for people too, and he had many ways to feed his family, to say the least.
Now let's bring in William Miller. Now, I did a little back research on Miller. I think I've got this right. Miller, who was born in the late 1700s, lived in what is today Vermont, a little bit east of Lake George in Hampton, New York. They call it, I think it was technically New York he was in, but right on the Vermont border. Anyway, he was up around there. He was a Baptist preacher, and I don't know the book of Daniel in the Bible, but apparently he did. And he knew passages and what he thought were clues that predicted when the second coming of Christ was going to happen, the ascension of everybody into heaven who were true believers. And he actually set the date of 1843 and said this is going to happen. He was part of this Adventist movement that he started, right? So, what happened when 1843 came and went and it didn't happen?
Well, it was somewhat of a concern to the people who had so much believed in it, but Miller, in reaction, admitted that, you know what, maybe it wasn't 1843, maybe I was off by a year. Maybe it's 1844. And then 1844 came and went, and then he moved on and said, actually, it's probably 1845. I'm actually sure it's 1845. And after those three consecutive failures, people kind of gave up on Miller's predictions at that point, and it was known to the Adventist community as the Great Disappointment.
Now, there was somebody who was not disappointed, and we're going to go back now to Clint Terry. It turns out that Clint, amongst all the other things he was doing, farming, coffin making, and all that, he was the leader of the Second Adventists in the greater Hartford, Springfield, Massachusetts area, right? And he didn't give up on this, did he?
No, he didn't. And there were a lot of people, particularly in the Northeast, that clung to the idea that there was some way to decode when the end of the world was going to be. And Clint Terry was one of them. And he became a very prominent figure in that movement. To give you an idea of how prominent he was, in the years following the events that we're going to talk about, both of his daughters ended up getting married to two brothers from Wilbraham, Massachusetts. And the wedding itself was this huge event to the point where there were special trains that were run from New York City, Hartford, and Springfield to get the wedding guests out to the island. So, I mean, he was an immensely important figure that had a large reach, even beyond the Springfield and Hartford area. He was very, very influential.
Now, we have to do just a little bit of religious history and political history here so people understand the significance of the date that Terry set for the end of the world. So you had this big war going on in Europe between the Prussians in Germany, and they were Protestants, not Catholics. And then you had them fighting the French, who were decidedly Catholic. And when the Prussians beat the French in the Battle of Sedan in 1870, Terry took this as a sign, didn't he?
He and his fellow Adventists took this as a sign that the papacy was on its last heels. And, this was a Protestant movement. The idea was that the Pope was not the legitimate representative of Christ on earth. And if the papacy was to fail, that would signal that the kind of the last great imposter would be gone and Christ would return. So the thought was that with Catholic France being defeated by Protestant Prussia, France was seen as the last great military and political backer of the papacy in Europe, the last great power behind it. And so, with that defeat, they figured the papacy would crumble soon afterwards. And for reasons that I was never able to really find out in the literature, the idea was that 3 years and 42 days from the start of the battle would mark the end of the world, which would be November 5th, 1873. And so after that battle, they saw it as a sign, and the Adventist movement began preparing once again for the end of the world.
Now, I was very curious and I looked up that date, and it turns out that was a Wednesday, just for the record. Now, as the actual event, drew clearer, people actually in the media started to pay attention, right? You had the Springfield Union, the Hartford Courant, they were all focusing on this. And I guess there was an article in the Springfield Union that said people started showing up October 19th, a couple weeks beforehand, and sort of paint the picture. What happened there on the island over the next couple weeks?
It kind of became a religious revival type atmosphere. You had believers, at one point over 100 of them, coming to the island. There were sermons being given. There was fervent group prayer. The speakers, interestingly enough, acknowledged that the previous times that the end of the world had been predicted, they were incorrect. They acknowledged their disappointment, but in acknowledging that disappointment, they expressed their certainty that this time they were absolutely correct. So we have this kind of festival atmosphere. It is somber in some ways, but it's also joyful because these people believe that they are going to ascend to heaven to be with God. The newspapers, for their part, were very reverent in their description of them. And they said, these are these people's sincerely held beliefs. We aren't here to make fun of them. There is even some concern expressed in the Springfield Union that this event was going to potentially occur the day after the Massachusetts state elections. And so there was some concern on their part that they might have gotten the date right, and kind of tying the election to some sort of the end of the world.
So I understand that these believers who came to the island in this, semi-festive atmosphere, as you report, actually brought their ascension robes, and some wanted to get even a little closer to heaven. Can you tell us that part of the story?
There was no specific hour that this was supposed to happen. There was just a date. And Adventists had some ascension robes. And so some wanted to be the first to get to heaven. They're wearing just these robes, and they are climbing the trees that are left on the island that haven't been felled for the purpose of farming. And they are getting up as high as they can because they want to be the first people to ascend to heaven. And so, you had the thought of people waiting all day in a tree on a cold November day. It must not have been comfortable, to say the least.
So now let's put this together. We're obviously doing this episode today, so the day came and went, and nobody was, world didn't end and whatnot. But just as in the past, the believers said, well, maybe we were off by a day or so, and so they stayed on the island, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. And so, at first it was, well, you know what? Maybe we just missed by one day or 2 days. But it became apparent as the days wore on that it wasn't going to happen. And this time around, there had been yet another disappointment. And unfortunately for poor Clint, this was already a spiritual disaster, and it morphed into a material disaster. because basically the people that remained on the island ate him out of house and home. It was reported that he had a flock of over 100 turkeys. By the time the people left, those turkeys were no more. I mean, you got to think about how much food one turkey can give you. And they just basically ate poor Clint out of house and home. And so as the food dried up, the people finally left, and there were even some reports about some folks who came from New Haven, some Adventists, and there were some questions raised if these people were actually true believers or they had just come for kind of a festival and a free meal.
Now, this event occurred, as you said, in 1873. 5 years later is that great wedding that you were referencing earlier, where his two daughters got married in a double wedding, that 300 people came to the island and whatnot. But then, not too long after that, by close up to 1900, I guess 1895, now he's not feeling well. His health is bad. He sells the island. He thinks the person who's going to buy the island is going to maintain the house and live there, but they don't. And I guess they actually end up moving the house somewhere into Windsor Locks area. And then he ends up passing away 10 years later. He went up to live with his daughter, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. He ended up working in the coal business, and his daughter was living in Brightwood. This was a new section of Springfield that was being developed. He ended up moving there, and he died in 1905.
Now, you can visit the island, as I understand it. I guess Eversource technically owns it and maintains it as a wildlife management area. No real established trails, but there is like a campsite there. Do you ever go over there? What's it like?
You know, I have never gone camping there, but it's interesting because I have walked on the Windsor Locks Canal Trail for a good portion of my life. So I've seen that island so many times. Right now, you would really never know unless you got on the island and saw what, you and I had talked about previously, the foundation and the remains of the tow rope. You'd really never know that it was inhabited by humans. You would never know that it was once a farm, except for those two things. So it's very much back to nature as it is now. It is really a true wildlife preserve, but there still are those hints there. And it's very interesting to think that if you go and you walk around, and especially near the house, you can imagine where 100 people gathered for the end of the world, or you could very easily see how 300 people could have been there for what must have been a very grand wedding.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. Now, if you want to visit Kings Island, you could either take a boat from Suffield or Enfield, or if you're really daring, you can wait for a period of very low water flow in the Connecticut River and actually try to walk over on top of the stones. I wouldn't recommend it. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Tim Casey, a member of the Suffield Historical Society and the man who writes their blog, keeping interesting aspects of the region's history alive. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, it's called Scoville, and it marked a huge change in how society developed. What was Scoville, and why did it change our development trajectory? Well, the answer is the Scoville Library was the very first public library in the United States. Next week on Amazing Tales, we're going to review the fact that until Scoville Library opened, you had to be able to afford a subscription to a library in order to have access to their books and their knowledge. Scoville opened knowledge to the masses. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.